Welcome everyone to this 45 minutes on critical ecosystem areas, better biodiversity metrics for business. I'm delighted today to welcome Hugo Rainey from the Wildlife Conservation Society. Hugo is a member of our Standards Committee, has been working for some years with us on that, and will be presenting today on critical ecosystem areas, these metrics to better measure and deliver decision-making opportunities for business. So welcome to the 45 minutes on Hugo.
Thank you.
At the moment, we're in the middle of COP, right? Everyone is hearing lots about greenhouse gases and climate change, and we're in the middle of an important COP to do with movement towards a 1.5 degree future. But there's another COP coming up. There's a COP coming up in December around the Convention for Biological Diversity. And it's an equally important COP, given that it's to do with the heavy loss of nature that we're seeing in the world today and the need for the reversal of that decline. And so having metrics to measure biodiversity loss or opportunities for ecosystem services, biodiversity growth are very important. So that's why Hugo's with us today to talk about some of those metrics. As I mentioned before, it's a Q&A session, so Hugo's going to present for us for around 25 minutes, and then we're going to have some Q&A from the group. Please do use the Q&A box rather than the chat, and I'll moderate in the meantime. But with that, I think we're at the full attendance now, so I will hand over to Hugo, please, to present on your work on critical ecosystem areas, better biodiversity metrics for business.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning all, good afternoon all, wherever you are. Thanks very much for your time. So today, just talking about an opportunity to improve how business can measure and report on what's important about biodiversity, not necessarily about biodiversity. So I hope this is helpful, and we can make progress towards things like biodiversity targets and the ASI standard. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview, we'll look at some of the standards that are around, including ASI's performance standard. We'll discuss some of the challenges and opportunities for biodiversity indicators. And we'll look specifically at some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing, and how that relates to some progress towards a sort of standardization or core components of metrics, and how this can inform decision-making around mitigation and reduction of impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services, including carbon. And we also provide a few links for resources and data, which you can use later on. Thank you. Yes, so some of the existing standards I'm sure you've heard of. These are the sort of core sort of best practice in a way that have been around for a while. IFC Performance Standard 6 has been around since 2012 in its current form. ICMM has provided some important documents and recommendations linked to that. And then we have new initiatives such as Science-Based Targets Network and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and Align, which aims to combine much of this thinking, and the EU Biodiversity Forum, EU Business and Biodiversity Forum. So lots going on, and of course we have the ASI standard, which is on our next slide, please. So Chris obviously is the director of standards, so do chip in if you have additional points to make. So I'm just going to discuss here about the standard two main aspects of it, both the disclosure, the transparency around that, but also obviously the biodiversity and ecosystem services component. So in two areas of the standard, it discusses transparency and reporting. And I think this is very helpful. It just allows you it will provide some clarity on what you're required to do if you've signed up to the performance standard, and that helps bring scientific rigor and confidence in what you're doing. So not just as an NGO, but also I think internally for management of information. I think it simplifies what you're being asked to do. Next slide, please. So the biodiversity and ecosystem services, apologies, the figure overlaps there. Some of it is quite basic. You're required to do an ISHA, but a risk assessment and impact assessment. But importantly, in the principle states that you're managing the biodiversity and ecosystem services in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy. And that's important because it allows you to go through things in a rigorous way and hopefully move the focus towards avoidance of impacts and minimization, the preventative measures rather than the compensatory measures. So I suppose, well, there are a number of aspects of the standard which set fixed targets or set limits on what you're required to do. It's not that prescriptive, which has its benefits and it's perhaps its limits in some respects, but it is useful to have these. So in 8.2 it says ensure that your biodiversity action plan is designed in accordance with the mitigation hierarchy to achieve no net loss. So that's great, and that's an important target to work towards. Does set you some questions. What on earth does that mean? And we'll talk a bit more about that later. And another important point is that it requires you to work with affected populations and organisations, indigenous minority peoples and so on. I'm not going to go into all the detail there. You can read it, but these are sort of highlighted points. Next slide, please. The other sort of two major sort of constraints for the standard are that there's a commitment to no-go in World Heritage sites. So these are, I think, really these are by far the most important sites for biodiversity in the world. It's not exclusive. There are some other areas which are of similar importance, but this is a particularly important component. Similarly, the protected areas are people who sign up to the standards are recommended not to mine or explore in protected areas unless there are some exceptional conditions that are met. And Chris, I did notice that there was a potential typo in 8.5b there. I don't know if we can follow up on that later. So that's why I've got so many sort of bits cut out of the standards. So anyway, so that's a brief overview of the standard. Chris, I don't know if there's anything you want to chip in there, but obviously just let me know.
Thanks, Hugo. No, please, I'd encourage people to go and look at the standards as well, and the guidance also that flows along with those. And what you talk about today, I guess, is going to be fed into the guidance too, with much of the references and some of the data incorporated into future versions of the guidance as well. And I think we'll get some questions probably on guidance on how.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, as I said, the standard sets us some questions about what we're required to do. What is no net loss? How you go about some of your risk assessment, as biodiversity is quite complex. So next slide, please. So the sort of ongoing discussion around biodiversity, global biodiversity policy and standards is evolving. We have the climate COP at the moment. There's the conventional biological diversity COP in December, COP 15. And some of the standards and initiatives that are going on at the moment are looking at nature positive, and there's a close link between climate and biodiversity sort of policies that are going on. And just recently I was talking to Mark Goff at the Capitals Coalition, and he pointed out it's hard to achieve net zero for carbon without being nature positive. There is a draft nature positive definition from IUCN that's being reviewed, and it's basically it's expanding beyond phrases like no net loss, net gain, to be more encompassing about the actions that you're trying to achieve. So it's more, in a way, you could talk about it as systemic rather than project focused or action focused. So I think that's something I'd encourage you to read about. it is evolving, and it's I hope it's not confusing, but in some ways it's helpful because it focuses on outcomes rather than on particular actions. Next slide, please. So just to sort of summarize it, it's nature positive. What does nature positive mean for business? It's shifting the focus towards a corporate level or systemic level strategy and actions. So it's moving away in terms of the mitigation hierarchy. It's moving away from the remediative actions such as restoration of impacts or offset or compensation for impacts towards the avoidance and minimization. So that it's helpful in that you're more likely to achieve better outcomes because you've taken early action and the more effective actions. So there are existing papers. There's the WBCSD, what does nature positive mean for business paper. There's also the ongoing development by the IUCN IMEC, the Impact Mitigation and Ecological Compensation thematic group, is developing a paper on this. So watch this space. And as I said before, there are many different business initiatives and around what businesses are required to do. And because there are so many, there's a coalition of partners that have come together to look at some of these questions and combine processes so that that there's reduced confusion. And so it's Business for Nature is the group, well, not a group, the coalition, perhaps we can call it, and it sort of puts the actions that you're recommended to do into 4 groups. So assess what your potential impacts and dependencies are, measure them, value them, prioritize them. Then set science-based targets. So commit to those, so that you're heading in you're on the right track towards global goals, global targets. And then transform your operations, your actions, your plans, so that you're able to avoid and reduce impacts. And you can see the focus there is more towards avoidance and reduction of impacts before they occur. So shifting business strategy. And all around that, there's disclosure at every stage to improve the scientific rigor of what you're doing, but also enable you to benefit from data and data sources, scientific expertise, that sort of thing. There's an awful lot of people, such as myself, working on helping business to reduce impacts, and engagement, I think, will reap results. Thank you. Next slide, please. So it's quite a complicated slide, but the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure does what it says on the tin. It is about disclosure, but it also links to metrics as well. So it is quite a sort of broad framework for how biodiversity can be incorporated or nature can be incorporated into strategy and reporting. The thing that I think sets it apart from some other initiatives is that it's LEAP, L-E-A-P. It's got a spatial aspect to it, and biodiversity is very locally specific. It's not like carbon, which is, carbon is the same wherever it is. But so having the spatial element of this reporting and assessment framework is very important. And then the others are, evaluate, assess, prepare is quite similar to the Business for Nature framework, as well as the disclosure on the right there. Next slide, please. So talking of carbon, so carbon is part of nature, and it is the carbon emissions and climate changes. We're at an unprecedented moment in time, as I'm sure many of us are aware. But the nature aspect of this is, I think, underplayed. So on the left-hand side here, you have the sources of CO2 emissions, and Industrial processes are obviously fossil fuels, and to a certain extent other sources of emissions are the main source, but 11% is from land use change, primarily from forest removal of forest and natural ecosystems, but also peat cutting, drainage, that sort of thing. And on the right hand side, you have the sinks, which is the air, forests, and the oceans. So if you cut down the forests, not only do you get more emissions, you have reduced capacity of the forests to absorb carbon. So there's a very, very close link between carbon emissions or carbon risk, climate risk, and nature risk. I think that's a really important aspect to consider. Next slide, please. So the climate scientists and politicians are way ahead of us. If I put myself in the biodiversity end of things, there's been a lot of work on the sort of global architecture, the agreements and the measurement frameworks, what this means for each country, and how individual corporate targets or other local targets are set. But on the nature side, on the biodiversity side, really the only bit which is sort of set in stone is the NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, which have been around for probably, I can't remember if it's since the first biodiversity agreement in the CBD agreement in '92, or but it was shortly after. So there are existing biodiversity targets, but they're pretty poor, remarkably unhelpful. So but the new global biodiversity framework in the top right there, the GBF, as everybody is talking it, is under discussion at the moment. The draft is actually rather good. It includes some really important concepts. Hopefully it will remain in a reasonable form after the biodiversity COP in December. So what does this mean, though, in terms of measurement and metrics? This is where it starts to get tricky, and I'll talk about one of the reasons that we have not been making progress, because I remember sitting in a meeting 2014 or something. I can remember somebody from industry going, "Oh, we need to sort out this biodiversity metric," and there has been some progress made. But there's a lot of work still to be done. Next slide, please. And this is the fundamental reason. Oh, where are we? Yeah, this is the fundamental reason. Biodiversity is not carbon, it's diverse. It's really complicated. The sort of a summary of the definition is it's the diversity of species, genes, ecosystems, and the linkages between them. So it's almost infinitely variable, which makes life really complicated if you're trying to measure some of it. And I think you all know that. Next slide, please. So the question for business is, if you're trying to measure and report against it, what do you do? What to measure and how to act? How do you select your targets and indicators? How do you, and this is a really important point, how do you link your mitigation actions to achieve your targets? And what do you do on a limited budget? There are so many different components of what you might be trying to consider. So it's really important to be efficient about how you go about it. Next slide, please. So perhaps if we just take a step back and consider how business interacts with nature, with biodiversity on the ground. The direct impacts are often reasonably clear. They're the planned impacts from your project, and this is from a project in Guinea, in case anybody is interested in bauxite in Guinea. You have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen on your project footprint. Next, please. But then you've got your the landscape, your area of interest around that, and there are unplanned impacts around that, but they're often fairly predictable. If you've got a road going in, if you've got people that are recruited to live there, you pretty much know what's going to happen, even if you can't say exactly when or how or the scale, but it's fairly predictable. And then next slide. And then you've got the cumulative impacts, which are completely outside an individual corporate's control. They're often outside the control of one single government agency. You know, you've got the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Mines and the Ministry of Planning all considering different options. It takes a lot of work for people to coordinate and make land use plans and resource plans. So there's many different points going in there. And the cumulative impacts combine the direct and indirect impacts of multiple projects. Quite a complicated mess. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, I hope you can see the bottom of the screen there, but the private sector or individual projects have most influence and control. That's sort of bottom left, the direct impacts. And on the right-hand side, government has more control, is more likely to have control. And then underneath, you've got the communities and people living in and around projects. So you have to recognize that no single actor can reduce or manage all the biodiversity and social impacts. So there needs to be a recognition of that when a project is being started or when a sector is developing its development plans. Next slide, please. However, fortunately, the direct drivers of loss are our savior, and the indirect drivers too. So compared to the myriad aspects of biodiversity, there are very few direct drivers and indirect drivers of loss. Yeah, direct drivers are invasive species, direct exploitation of resources, pollution, land and sea use change, and then climate change also is part of those. And the indirect drivers are the sort of political and socio-economic aspects of life, supply and production, consumption, poverty, human demography, governance, those sorts of things. Next slide, please. So there's only a handful of drivers to measure. Sorry, Chris. So this is where your entry point is. The drivers of biodiversity loss are your friend. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of metrics? How can we think about this? Now, there's been a lot of work recently on using global data sets. Yeah, there's satellite imagery and other sources of information. And people have mapped, for example, the human footprint to understand species extinction risk. And this is very broad scale, quite coarse data. But these data are available now at increasingly fine resolution. Next slide, please. So some of my colleagues have been working on a related metric, but which also tries to consider the drivers of biodiversity loss, both the observed human pressure, which is easier to map, things like infrastructure and agriculture, but also the inferred pressure, which is the less or the more the indirect impacts around human activities, such as people accessing along linear infrastructure and around agriculture. So it's much more complicated to understand, but it's actually fairly easy to map. And then combining this with the known loss of the loss of forest connectivity, which is fairly easy to assess with tools such as Marksan, you can then my colleagues have then produced effectively an index of what they call the Forest Landscape Integrity Index. Next slide, please. So this has been mapped globally at high resolution. Now this initial first cut was fairly low resolution. I can't remember. I think it was 1K by 1K. But the data are available, and new data are available at, I think, down to even 10 meters by 10 meters or finer. So the information on the pressures on biodiversity, on the drivers of biodiversity loss are available. Now, this is just for forests, but there are similar information that is being analysed and assessed for different types of ecosystems. Next slide, please. So, what does it actually mean at a finer scale? How do we incorporate this into decision making? So, perhaps I should have put a slide in on species, and there is an existing species metric, global species metric called STAR, which is available and covers effectively risk to species across the world and the opportunity to reduce risk. And that's available and has been quite well tested and is worth a look. But on the ecosystem, it forms one of the three components of biodiversity, species ecosystems and ecosystem services. So understanding ecosystem risk and in particular ecosystem integrity. Oh, thanks, Chris. So the ecosystem integrity as a core component of ecosystem condition is really important. So I won't go into too much detail here, but this is a helpful slide if you're trying to understand how to measure things. So so a recent paper showed that core components of an ecosystem goal or indicators are the ecosystem data, its type and extent. And then you have a form of priority assessment, and that can include protected areas or World Heritage sites, Ramsar sites. It can include community areas. It can include sites that have been assessed against the IUCN Red List of ecosystems. So that's the second component. And then the third component is an integrity measure. And I showed you the methodology just there. And if you combine these three components, and we've called this critical ecosystem areas, but there are other ways of combining it. But if you combine these three components, what it gives you is a small grid of priority against integrity. So that allows you to understand which areas are highest priority and the highest condition. So it combines condition and priority, as well as the spatial measure. And I think this is one of the first times that this type of information has been available at spatial scale. So next slide, please. So there's lots of information that this provides you, it can provide you with. So the dark blue, for example, shows you these areas are high priority, high integrity, and therefore they should be really the most important areas to protect, to avoid impacts on, to ideally not put infrastructure through them. But if you're considering restoration aspects or compensation, your offsets, you might want to look at areas that are high priority but low integrity. So the yellow sites, for example, the bright yellow sites, those are areas that are degraded but could be potentially important for improving connectivity for your, if you're required to do offsets to achieve no net loss. These areas could be easily identified using this type of approach to for investment to achieve your no net loss goal or to achieve nature positive if you're looking at corporate wide approaches. So this type of information is really quite accessible and so on. And we've tested this methodology on the forest ecosystems of Myanmar, and thank you to the Al Kerr Foundation for supporting our work. They've been very helpful, and it's really I think the first time this type of methodology has been tested. Helpfully too, it also produces some numbers which you can collate or sort of cut into ecosystem types, but it does allow you then to report by risk category, either at project level or corporate level, and that allows you to report using this business for nature component. Next slide, please. So just to sort of summarize, what I'm encouraging people to think about is that let's move on beyond measuring biodiversity. because basically metrics on biodiversity inform measurement of biodiversity. You know, how many trees have we planted, or how many endemic plants are in your herbarium? It's really totally unhelpful. I once turned up at a forest in Guinea to look at a reforestation site, and they'd cut down some trees to plant some trees. That's the sort of thing that you want to avoid. Next slide, please. Yes, and then so what we want to do is look at the pressures that inform mitigation actions, because you can use these for reporting and you can use these for deciding what action to take. So, for example, what area of lion habitat have we helped communities to reduce impacts? Which exploration roads can be closed to reduce logging or fires, for example? That's where I'd encourage you to think about things. What measures help you to think about what you need to do? Next slide, please. So, and just a final point on this particular slide is that conservation and mitigation actions are socioeconomic or sociopolitical. They are not engineering questions. They are quite complex interactions with local communities and with decision makers. And they require a single coordinated environmental and social team at project level or even at corporate level if you're making site-based decisions. It's a very, very important point that many people, I think, could benefit from reviewing. Next slide, please. And so we have the COP coming up. We've got the Global Biodiversity Framework, and there will be new information, new indicators and targets arising from this. And this will allow you to, this will concentrate people's minds, I think, as we go into 2023. So thinking about biodiversity indicators in a different way, you know, measuring what you need to know rather than what is all around you will make life easier. You can't measure all of biodiversity, but you can measure some components of biodiversity that are important to you and your operations. And I think that's an important shift, is focusing on things that are relevant and helpful rather than trying to measure everything around you. Next slide, please. So that's sort of summary of some of the thinking we've been looking at, and I've got 3 slides here on resources. So my colleagues are running the combo program, which has some resources on there, and they're active in Guinea. Next slide. I've got just a couple more slides on resources. We don't need to spend too much time on these, but they're available to you if you want to look at the slide pack at the end when they're on the website, the ASI website. Next, and one more slide. And just a nice list of databases for you, or resources for you. So there you go. Hope there's lots of questions.
Thanks very much, Hugo. Thanks. There's certainly questions from me, and I encourage people to use the Q&A box at the bottom as well. One of the things, you know, there's complexity on the one hand, but also the availability of data on the other is quite incredible. We often do get questions about, you know, what do I do at kind of project level? There's loads of material out there. The question is how it gets kind of scaled up to these bigger systems. And maybe we can discuss a little bit about the role of ASI in that in a moment. But before then, I've got a question which is on this, maybe on the this focus at a very small localized scale, right? So if we look at the critical ecosystem areas as a relative measure of the ecosystem extent, priority, and the forest integrity kind of coming together at the scale of, I think you mentioned, up to 10 meters square, is the vision then a bit too narrow? The focus on critical ecosystem areas, does that take away from a landscape-based approach, which takes account of a bigger area, or is that built into the critical ecosystem areas method?
So when we tested the method of the critical ecosystem areas methodology, it was trying to remember the scale. I think it was about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, so quite coarse. But you can work at any scale that's relevant to you. So if you have very high resolution data, let's say 10 meters by 10 meters, That allows you to work at project level because you can see clearly where roads are, where you've got a frontier of deforestation, for example. But but it doesn't preclude you from working at large scales, across a landscape or across the region with the mineral resource if you're a government planner. So as long as the methodology works and as long as the data are available and you've got somebody who's got some competency in doing the assessment, you can use that. You can apply that methodology if you've got high or moderate resolution data.
Is the we've talked about this before actually. I know the answer, so maybe I should be asking the question. But what about the quality of that data and some kind of measure of the confidence of the different metrics going into the method?
So I think just particularly for this type of methodology, and there are other ways that you could look at it as long as the core components of ecosystem type and extent, integrity and priority are looked at. But if you've got good ecosystem data, then it's possible to do this at good ecosystem data and a time series of ecosystem data, satellite imagery over 10 or 5 years. Then you can develop this type of action because you'll be able to see land use change or frontiers of deforestation or restoration sites, even offset sites. You can see that change over a relatively short period of time.
So that goes to a question that's coming from Elena actually, which is this kind of definition of critical ecosystem area. And what I hear, tell me if I'm wrong, is that it's a relative term, right? It's about decision making. It is relative. It's not a kind of fixed boundary. If this is critical, this is not. It's about how you use that data to define, your own understanding of criticality. Is that right, or is there a kind of formalized cutoff for criticality?
Yeah. So the sort of definition of what's important is dependent on the user and your location. So what is important in Guinea might not be the same as is important in Western Australia. So there are the prioritization process, which is part of it, will depend on what does the law say. You've got protected areas, community areas, Ramsar sites. Those might be different in one country or one jurisdiction from in another jurisdiction. So the name itself is a name that we've given it, and it's the publication will be out, I hope, over the next few weeks, at least in preprint. So we'll share that. But it's about the local context. So if you're able to make internal decisions about priority, that's fine. I'd encourage you to work with local communities, local governments, those sorts of things. But it's about individual informing project or potentially corporate decision making.
So that we've had a question come in by email actually, is what can separate government departments, bodies do to better coordinate on these issues? I'm going to expand that question actually into all stakeholders. So not just the government departments, but individual projects, local communities. This is the data and the kind of decision-making tools that they use, but how do they come together to affect change? That's a big question.
Yeah.
So
that's a really good question. And I'm going to be slightly provocative. There was Prapenda Diallo had a question about what my colleagues in Congo are doing in Guinea. So I'll link those. Is that Guinea has huge mineral resources, particularly bauxite and iron ore, but also things like diamonds and gold. But just looking at bauxite from ASI's point of view, it covers a lot of the northwest part of the country. Partly because Guinea is developing very rapidly, but it's coming from quite a low base. It would be helpful, I think, if ASI and its different partners were to work closely with the government to at landscape or strategic level, certainly at sectoral level, to try and improve data availability and use of data. There's both the capacity in terms of data quality and availability, but also the understanding how to use the data. So that's one aspect of it. And it is hard for individual corporates to combine decision making because it's a competitive world and you've got confidentiality and so on. But if you can build internal capacity in the sectoral agencies within government, then they can improve planning, and that can simplify and reduce costs for industry. I mean, in Guinea, I think, I can't remember how many ports are being planned by each different company, but that's a complete waste of resources if you really think about it. How many ports does Guinea need? There is an opportunity for industries to save money, but it's obviously difficult to do without sort of central planning.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be provocative in my answer and say we are, and I'm going to read off the official title, we're a sustainability standards development and certification initiative, right? That's what we do at our heart with entities. So the linkage of those goes beyond that certification, and certainly we do explore that as an initiative. But should that be the priority action? It's not about certification of projects. It is about bringing together stakeholders more broadly, especially on some of these high risk issues.
Well, yeah, it's a sort of philosophical question for ASI and its members, but to help achieve the standards, to help become certified, it could, particularly in areas with weaker governance, it could be easier if there's a sort of a broader investment to build capacity in places like Guinea and so on, where governance could do with a boost. Where capacity is taking some time. It's come a long way since I first went to Guinea in, I think, 2002, but there's still a lot of work to do to achieve the standards that you might want to see.
So if we look at the questions coming in now, some of them, you can see there's a lot on guidance, and then there's a lot on what do I do in this situation? Give me a list of something that I can do. I heard from your presentation that's not necessarily the most helpful thing that ASI can do, given the specificity in different situations.
Yeah. So just looking at the question on the endangered species within a 50k radius. So I think IBAT, which I haven't got on my list here, integrated biodiversity assessment tool, I think that will provide the sort of information you're looking for. But there are other ways to look at it too, through the IUCN Red List of Species as a screening tool, I think. But IBAT's a place to start. I mean, you have to have a budget for it, but.
And we do, we list that on the guidance. I think that's again to say, and I think in the presentation today is to say, there's lots of information out there, but it's not about it's not about spoon feeding you. You've got to go in and ask the questions of the data, complex questions of complex data with a range of stakeholders to prioritize risks in your areas and then manage those accordingly. It's not a threshold of here's what you do when you have more than.
Yeah. So, and understanding that data or translating it into non-specialist decision making, it does require perhaps either hiring an environmental or biodiversity person or consultant to help you, at least to make those first steps. And I think that would be useful. And once you've got that information, then you can make progress.
Fantastic. Maybe I'll make a plug as well for more broadly some of the training material that is available and will be coming in this space too, but also the work of registered specialists and local specialists, community specialists in translating that work as well. It's not enough just to have biodiversity experts looking at the data, I would say. You also need people who can talk to local communities, who understand the local specificities as well and can translate that to the range of stakeholders on the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
Hugo, we've got
another question there I saw from Piet. If we have time.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, please.
Yeah. So
maybe I'll say the question. Is competition among mining firms active in adjacent and overlapping areas a complicating factor, or is it a stimulus to do better than your competitors, also in environmental aspects?
I mean, I'd say that I think probably competition is generally neutral in terms of increasing or decreasing risk. there is the bottom line. Everybody has to do things within a budget, so that is a potential higher risk. But equally, particularly some companies, they have a higher sort of public corporate image, so that can drive better environmental performance. So I don't think it's a particular issue. I mean, competition is a good thing in general. Makes you more efficient. You can develop new technologies, new ideas. So I'm all for it.
Is there a way to mine the data to see if that works or not? So if I take Guinea, let's say, as an example, where you have separate mining leases in a shared area, and then shared infrastructure like railways, for instance, there you can see both cooperation in one aspect of the mine site and its related infrastructure, as well as competition. Could the data tell you something about changes over time and in the space?
Well, yes, certainly data can help you understand what's happening, but data doesn't force you to make a particular decision unless there is a policy or regulation or a standard which requires you or recommends that you do something. So particularly for large-scale infrastructure, unless you've got planning or regulation or agreements between companies to cooperate on infrastructure, I presume it's quite hard to develop those together. So having some form of better or regulation which helps, and these are big questions, I understand, but having some form of regulation which encourages people to work together on infrastructure, I think probably reduces impacts and probably even reduces costs.
We certainly, I think that's embedded in the area of influence terminology that we've kind of woven through the new version of the standard, looking beyond the mine fence. That area of influence is important because that's where the overlaps happen. That's where you have multiple stakeholders involved.
Yeah.
Hugo, we have, if folks want to come for the second part, we have another one of these in about 8 hours time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Come to both.
Absolutely. Hugo, we've got some questions that have come in from the audience. One is around the cumulative impact assessment project data, or the cumulative impact assessments that's going on, and if you know of any that apply free, prior, and informed consent principles with Indigenous peoples and/or communities, but maybe also you can expand on how the data, how decision making could be communicated to local communities and to Indigenous communities who may not have access to or familiarity with the data underlying key ecosystem services.
Yeah. So cumulative impacts are complex, and I'm not aware of any processes or that actively consider cumulative impacts as a planning level. But there are some tools which I think must do that. So strategic environmental assessments is one methodology, and these have been applied by bilateral and multilateral agencies. So I think they must include FPIC and community engagement. Otherwise, they would be failing their own internal standards. But I don't know the detail that starts of individual processes. I think there is one in Uganda, a strategic environmental assessment for the Albertine Rift that was done in about 2014 or 2016. Might be worth looking at.
Okay.
And pass that on.
Thank you.
But in terms of guidance and so on, it might be useful to collate existing guidance or existing methodology to see what it says about cumulative impacts for minorities, for Indigenous peoples and communities and so on.
I mean, that's a challenge that we see. You mentioned it earlier on, right? These are not kind of engineering issues. These are kind of socioeconomic issues that are at the heart of these kind of decision-making processes. And how you can build tools that bring all those different elements together is really difficult. And I guess that's led to, I mean, there is a question that's come in about ASI's why we've not included key biodiversity areas in our no-go. And that's how I feel a little bit the conversation going, is that as these complex models and complex processes come together, and how you manage a really complicated risk on the ground, often the response is, well, make it no-go. Just have a blanket threshold for access, and that's it. Then you don't have to have the conversation. What do you think the future of some of these discussions is going to be? Is it increasing complexity in decision making, or do you think it is about red lines and that's it?
Well, the practical level, it's often an economic decision by a particular government. So that's there's a fairly clear answer to that. However, if there is investor standards, or if, as has happened in some countries, there's been investment to conserve the most important areas, by Norway, I think, has invested in Gabon's forests, for example, to prevent deforestation. If there is that type of investment, that can then drive better protection of the most important sites. But so I'll sort of give two answers. The first one is that the performance standard is one driver of a particular standard, obviously, but a particular threshold of where you can and cannot go. But national policy, where an investment is taking place, will also and is generally takes priority over that. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect to it is that although the standard was developed was approved in 2022, May this year, there is the GBF coming out. If the politics changes, if the optics change, there could be pressure to update it. I mean, I don't want to.
No.
Put pressure on you.
I guess I kick in here, right? Because you're absolutely right. We have that's the Standards Committee. It's, if you go to our website, you can see the Standards Committee minutes for all previous meetings. We've said that if there is a significant change coming out of CBD, or coming out of some of the other ongoing, evolving, and really fast developing discussions, then there is room for normative language change before the next revision period in 5 years' time. In particular, I think, around greenhouse gases, biodiversity, ecosystem services, those two areas with such quick evolution. We're in the middle of some dynamic discussions. We don't necessarily want to wait, and yet at the same time, we did have to publish something in 2022 in order to meet our commitments under ISEAL. So absolutely right. I think it's a product of its time, but it's fast moving. I think the other thing to note, and you answered it as well in your answer, is that with national policy potentially trumping the ASI standard, the response came back. If it's no go for ASI certs, that doesn't stop no go for many miners or many operations around the world. So why are you saying no to potentially high performing entities versus others? Now, that was a difficult discussion and I think it's an evolving discussion as well. So I think that while that was answered in the last revision period, that doesn't mean that that's not a discussion that is ongoing, I think, into the future as well. Questions come in as well on how critical ecosystem metrics account for invasive species, climate change, and pollution. Would that come under the ecosystem, the kind of forest integrity piece, or how does that fit into the metric?
So invasive species will tend to come in along human corridors and routes. So they would probably be captured as part of integrity. If you're looking at things like chromolina or cane toads, or I suppose things like water hyacinths will spread along waterways and so on, slightly different, but invasive species could be like that. Pollution can be more diffuse if it's airborne. If it's water-based, it wouldn't necessarily account well for the metric wouldn't account well for pollution, I don't think. And climate change is global, so it wouldn't necessarily account for that. But that is also is outside the direct control pretty much of most projects. So it's not necessarily the right metric for that.
Could you overlay it? I mean, could you see some of these additional layers coming on top? An example I give is we're looking at some of this in the community health aspect, right? And resilience to a changing climate. Yeah. And that's needing to be built into project plans, you know, because you've got to know what kind of access to waters there's going to be in 15 months' time with demographic change, 15 years' time with demographic changes.
Yeah, you can include the sort of demographic change, the risk from that in as a separate layer, or fire risk if and that it could inform mitigation if you know, replanting, restoring forest, or re-wetting peatlands might reduce that risk, or linked to climate change, and that could be that can inform your decision making. Yeah.
Do you see the uptake of this metric more on the kind of is it more the project side? Because earlier on you talked about the kind of nature positive and this systemic change that's at the boardroom level rather than at the project level. Do you see the discussion of these metrics being all the way through that system, or is it really being applied at the project level? And maybe also something on the role of governance in there as well, and other stakeholders in that decision making.
I think there are so many different projects, different actors involved in individual projects that although there will be, hopefully, well, people will perceive it as helpful and relatively useful once the broader data layers, you know, once there's a more global assessment. But I think the real change will be through planning, and you know, if the let's say, well, we hope in the future we'll be able to do a sort of more regional assessment in Amazonia. So if the governments of, say, Colombia or Brazil look at it and think it's helpful, it would be relatively, that would influence a lot of planning, you know, very large areas, because you'll have assessment of a lot of forests. So, you know, there's quite a lot of work to be done for that by my colleagues and myself, but that would influence more people than one or two projects doing it. But if projects start doing it, you know, if ASI says, oh, you know, if ASI's members say they like it, or you know, IUCN buys into it and thinks it's good, and so that's a stakeholder group, people take it up, then that will be helpful. But just sort of to answer one of the questions here, if that's on the its components, is that the methodology has been tested on Myanmar's forests. We want to apply it to different geographies to make sure that it's to see how useful it might be and how adaptable it might be to different ecosystem types, different contexts. And so hopefully we've got these core components of, you know, as we're saying here, ecosystem data and priority data, you know, spatial priority data of protected areas or KBAs or community areas, and integrity data. Hopefully those core components are relevant in a very wide range of geographies, and then that will that simple approach can then help people take it up more easily. I'm not trying to impose a specific methodology. It's just, are these components useful in a particular area?
And maybe because if it's a function of all three of those, or if I think function rather than cumulative of each of those, well, we talked about it a little bit this morning. What's the quality differential like between those? So I guess for the priority information, there's IBAT and other systems in place. How about the other elements? What's the kind of quality like between those different pieces? That's the first thing. And the second thing is all of that data open source or available for all to use?
So we've tested it in Myanmar, and those data are now available on it's called the Myanmar Biodiversity Zone, or Ziwa Zone in Burmese, when we roll it out or we test it in other areas, those data will be publicly available. You know, we hope that organizations or institutions such as WCMC will be able to hold it. So just in terms of the inputs, you know, what are the constraints on doing this? And one of the hardest things is having good ecosystem data. If you have typology, describing the ecosystems, and the spatial data. If they don't exist, then you have to do them. Yeah. So that's a bit of an issue. So if we want to work in Amazonia, we know there are data for Colombia, but in Brazil, the data are apparently not quite so well sort of mapped. So there are constraints there. So those are the main aspects we need to work on. And then there's the resolution data. Higher resolution is more useful, obviously, for everyone.
And would it have to flow through you, this information, to get in, or is there the opportunity eventually for people who are doing their own analyses to kind of upload these data sets?
Well, what we want to do is test it at regional level. If people like the idea, that's great. And I hope people recognize what we've done, but we're certainly not intending to be gatekeepers. And yeah, we'll put the data and methodology out there. We have a draft paper that's under development, should be put ready for preprint before COP, so that will be available. Right. And as an example, if we have some data, if we do an assessment, say in 2022, using data from 5 years ago, in 5 years' time, the government of a country let's call them Aluminium Corp, they decide to do an assessment in their project area. If they want to do that with their own data, that's great. We hope that they can access the original data should be publicly available for them.
Great. Well, with that, I think we're at time now. So thank you very much, Hugo. Really excited to see what happens next, and also to see how we can potentially integrate into ASI's work as well. And looking at the questions coming in from the audience today, lots of interest as well in how ASI standards develop into the future as well. So with that, thank you very much, Hugo, for joining us today, both this morning early on and also now. And thank you as well to the audience for all your questions and for your great engagement. Thanks all very much. See you on the next 45 minutes on.